Bene, buonasera, mi sa che possiamo dare il benvenuto a tutti per iniziare questo primo webinar sul centenario di Psicologia delle masse e analisi dell'io. Sarà appunto il primo di una serie di 15 incontri che avranno una cadenza quasi bisettimanale. Vi presento, sono Raffaele Bracalenti, sono presidente dell'Istituto Psicoanalitico per le Ricerche Sociali, che è uno degli enti insieme alla Sapienza di Roma, all'IREP, all'Istituto Elio Facchinelli e alla European Journal of Psychoanalysis, uno degli enti organizzatori di questa serie di eventi, come dicevo. Il titolo lo conoscete, è stato iscritto: Soggetto e masse, la psicanalisi e le politiche dell'inconscio. Oggi iniziamo con Bruno Moroncini. L'incontro di oggi ha per titolo La democrazia e il tratto di padre. In questo lungo percorso che terminerà, se non ricordo male.
Well, this is just the beginning of our long journey that we have finished, that will conclude on the 15th of December, if I am correct. You'll find the list of speakers who include philosophers, such as today, philosophers who have dealt with psychoanalysis, historians, politologists, but also. So I think that we can start today's meeting, as I said. We'll talk about democracy and the trait of father. So Bruno Marchini is our speaker. He teaches moral psychology, philosophy at the University of Salerno. He has always dealt with psychoanalysis and most especially Lacan, and he will develop a series of theses. You can find all of these theses in the Account of Politico published by Pronopio in 2014. And most especially, he's going to refer to the third chapter entitled The Policy of the Unconscious, but also in the fourth chapter will be addressed. And I think that you will find a reference to the thoughts that Bruno is going to share with us today. So I would like to start, I would like to begin by highlighting a couple of ideas that you can find in this book. Well, first of all, I would like to hear if my interpretation of this idea is right, or and if Bruno can better explain this, because in the fourth chapter of your book, you conclude the chapter by saying something very strict: democracy is woman. And I think that this is the result of something that started with Lacan, because Lacan said that it's impossible to formulate the universal, the feminine universal. So woman, the woman, singular, does not exist, while women exist, whereas the opposite applies to men. And so from this impossibility to formulate the universal concerning women, there is also the impossibility to develop a sort of law that regulates a structure of power or a group. So we might say, in my view, that Antigone cannot write any norm, so this is a non-written rule. But we might also say that Antigone was also the one who had to fight, the one who somehow limited power. So I was curious to know, in this interpretation given by Bruno Marchini, well, maybe this could be a representation of the checks and balances in democracies, because these functions of limiting the exercise of power also contain and somehow help develop democracy. That is why we might say that democracy is a woman, is feminine. And there is also another point that I perceived in your work. In your text, you tried to describe, let's say, to reduce life to individual life, as if you tried to, again, limit spirituality, as if spirituality was limited. Well, if we talk about that, we shouldn't be surprised that you draw your inspiration from Lacan. And so this is perceived also in the neuroscientific approach. So I wondered if in this attempt to defend this dimension, which is not purely biological, because it is also spiritual in a way. So how can this reconcile with the clear Marxism that Bruno Marchini is a herald of? Because your the type, let's say, of communism that you support is quite unique. So I was wondering, this dimension in which this dimension of spirituality, how can it combine with this form of spirituality? Because I think that this is an element that can be found in Lacan, but I wanted to know if and how this is compatible with Bruno Moroncini's Marxism. So these are just two elements that really struck me. And I will stop here and I will leave the floor to Bruno Moroncini. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wish to thank Pietro Pascarelli and Sergio for inviting me to this initiative, which is very important as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the publication of mass psychology. And this type of psychology is so current in my view, and we will see how. So thank you also, because I am the first speaker in this series of seminars that will accompany you for the whole year. And I also wish to thank the two interpreters, because I am used to speak very fast. Well, I have to say that I do not envy them. And also, please let me know if I speak too fast, because I know that it will be very difficult to follow me. Well, first of all, I wish to thank Raffaele Bracalenti for his presentation. I would first of all like to make a couple of precisions, very trivial ones. I do not teach anymore because I retired from my teaching position, so I am no longer a university professor. And the second precision is that the chapter that he referred to, and that I, let's say, identified as the general guidelines of my presentation, is called the Policies of Anguish, of Anxiety, why he called it Policies of the Unconscious. Well, that was a lapsus probably. Well, first of all, Raffaele Bracalenti took things well from the end. In fact, he started from the end of a very lengthy thought. I do not know whether I will get to the point where I said that democracy is female, also because I feel that I have to stick to the text more properly. Also, because we are talking about this text more specifically, so we'll talk about mass psychology and the analysis of the ego. But anyway, I will see whether we will also have the time for questions and answers, and I will see whether we will be able to talk about democracy during the Q&A session. Anyway, the theme of democracy is present because I put it in the title. However, for the moment, democracy is connected As Freud said in mass psychology, it is linked to the trait of father. I called it trait of father, and I hope that it will become clear why I chose this expression, which might seem a bit odd. So I would like to mention a recent book called La Cosa Godente, edited by Pietro Pascarelli, which is a series of answers that many of us, especially philosophers, gave to a questionnaire that was prepared on the relationship between psychology and psychoanalysis. Well, certainly various philosophers were called in, were involved, as they had shown an explicit interest for psychoanalysis in psychoanalysis, so I was also involved. And one of these questions was about what was called up to very recently, and is still called at the moment, the Marxism. And I answered to that question in a brutal way, because I said this type of Marxism, Freudo-Marxism, has always been, according to me, a cultural construct which is really not useful. It is useful. It is quite unlikely, you know, the idea of putting together, and so I'm starting to respond to Raffaele's provocation. So, you know, Marxism and psychoanalysis, they should not go together, because they would both be, even though in different ways, in different fields, practices of liberation, because the Marxism entails the liberation of, you know, capitalists from capitalist work. And on the other hand, we have psychoanalysis that would free the erotic pulsions from the sexual phobic or repressive morals. So I think that this model didn't hold anymore. Also, because Michel Foucault's research showed that the idea that the modern world was a sexual phobic world, it couldn't hold anymore, but it was quite the opposite, in fact. And in fact, in the modern world, sexuality has become part of the discourse, of the general discourse. It has been studied thoroughly, and we also know that Foucault at one point also understood Freudian psychoanalysis and put it in this long process, in this long process in which sexuality was addressed. But this was done in order to put sexuality under control. Now, let us, put this matter aside. However, this shows also that the Freudo-Marxism, how Freudo-Marxism doesn't hold anymore. And I have always thought, and I said this in the answer to this questionnaire, that there is a possibility of putting Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxism together, but from the point of view of the constitution of sciences. And also these two discourses, which are very difficult to define, because there are sciences and therefore they have a scientific side to them, they also challenge the basis of modern science. So they can be put together, these two aspects, because they both represent a problem to the science of reference, because Marxism defined it as a critique of political economy. Marxism inherits a science which is political economy, but at the same time it challenges, it is a critique of some of the final effects of a scientific discourse when it is applied to a matter that is very difficult to handle, like the production and reproduction of human societies. Also, a political economy is, according to the model developed by Michel Foucault, one of the three human sciences, one of the three original strains of this discourse of human sciences, and the other two are biology and linguistics. And the third is actually political economics. Now, psychoanalysis, like psychology, after all, probably is derives from biology, because in a way it has to do with the living being, even though a living being it is a culturalized living being. And Lacan said that this living being has the characteristic of being a parless, which means that it is characterized by language. But the very idea, Freud's very idea that in the end, very advanced neurology would embrace, once again, psychoanalysis, helps us understand that psychoanalysis and psychology both come from that strain. Now, psychoanalysis is the critique, if you wanted to use a paragon, of psychology. So the science of reference is the psychological science, and psychoanalysis hits it in a very specific point, as in the constitution of this science, which is the primacy of the conscience, the supremacy of the conscience vis-a-vis the whole psychological life, the Absenleben, as Freud calls it. So this is a possible way, to connect psychoanalysis and Marxism. With regards the matter of Marxism as a theory of the capitalist society, but also, its various practical and political aspects, as I have clearly commented an article on mass psychology published by Sergio. Sergio answered saying, "Thank you, but I marvel at you because you're a Marxist and you agree with what I wrote." So probably either I was misunderstood or, well, anyway, in the end, we understood that there are many forms of Marxism. And there is a long tradition in which Marxism has been, many ways in which Marxism has been interpreted. So there are some aspects of Marxism which are mythological in nature. Now, this problem, I addressed it very early. My dissertation thesis was on Karl Korsch, an important Marxist theorist who lived in the first half of the 20th century. And I chose him for my dissertation because he was a he tries to challenge an internal transformation to Marxism. Korsch authored in 22-23 a text called The Marxism and Philosophy that was published at the same time as a work by Lukács. And it is that was the starting point of Western Marxism, which opposed the Stalinism, the philosophy of nature by Engels and so on. And Lenin called it an anthropological Marxism, an anthropological materialism, rather. However, that text relied upon the primacy of dialectics. In the early 1930s, Korsch wrote a monograph on Marx entitled Karl Marx that was published in a collection of classical books about sociology, and he totally changed his stance, his position, because Marx was no longer the philosopher of politics, but rather he became the scientist of capital, so he became an exponent of social sciences. It is interesting to see that Korsch was the teacher of Benjamin in his approach to Marx. So he started to read Marx quite late under the guidance of Korsch. This means that there are many different types of Marxisms, and that you can be a Marxist in the sense that you can take seriously texts such as the Capital, the Grundis, why not so other things, other texts which are more of an ideological critique, or other mythological aspects which are present in Marx, but maybe they are not the most interesting part. So I take that Marx is a major scientist of the capital. So he started the criticism of the capital, of capitalism. So I think that I appreciate psychology of the masses and the analysis of the ego. And I am at the same time a Marxist. Of course, then we need to understand what we feel, what we mean by communism. If communism is that a realization, for instance, if Marxism is like the place where we will be immune from any evil, well, this is an idea that is absolutely impossible to achieve. I do not think that communism as a political practice, as a government, can be that, but this is another matter, of course, that we will probably discuss at another time. So what I would like to highlight is the fact that I said in my answer to that questionnaire is that if we want to develop a relationship between psychoanalysis on the one side and social matters or historical and political matters, we need to refer to a series of texts from Freud.
So the core issue is psychology of masses and analysis of the I. So totem and taboo as well, the discomfort of society, maybe the exchange with Einstein for the war, and then this might be even more bizarre, a terminal text like monotheism and Moses. Why? Because in these texts, Freud actually emphasizes what is written actually at the beginning of Psychologie. That is that psychoanalysis is not an individual psychology. It's not even a psychology, so to say, according to the criterion of the strange methodological position for the scientific approach that can be attached to psychoanalysis. Because at the same time, it's a social psychology. That is, psychoanalysis does not conceive at any time the person as a single entity. It is taking care of the person from the clinical viewpoint, but not even in the moment in which we deal with the clinical approach. It's not a monad or a Robinson, meaning that in the creation of the self, according to Freud, there is always the presence of the other in different forms. A reassurer, a persecutor, a trustful person, and so on and so forth, as an authority with which we identify or fight. That is, the creation of a person is never external to a relation. That is a social relation, which is usually at the beginning limited. It explicitly refers to the family environment, which then can be enlarged to wider scopes and the whole social structure. There is not a problem from the point of view of Freud that cannot be analyzed as a social structure for psychoanalysis. And so I think that Psychologie and the analysis of the self is, as in this regard, has to be considered an intervention that regards social sciences and what psychoanalysis has to say. As for social sciences, from this point of view, I would like to emphasize a first point that has always interested me, because, in the interpretations of texts that I read in the past, it is said that Freud uses Gustave Le Bon, and there's a big debate on Gustave Le Bon that is actually up to date, even more than Freud. It's easier to relate this to a public debate because Le Bon is the one who theorizes the mass or the crowd, because Freud uses a certain terminology. The French term is translated with Massen, and so Psychologie, but he's thinking at a crowd, what Le Bon calls les folles, the crowd, because Le Bon's idea as a thinker, a reactionary thinker, is that the urban reality, as Freud said, even starting from the French Revolution, the end of the 18th century, presents the creation of this kind of phenomena, an aggregation, a very rapid aggregation with no assumptions of a group of people who all of a sudden, as they are many, they act in a certain modality that they would have never chosen if they were isolated, but which is made possible only thanks to the fact that they are aggregated and in a crowd. So these are the fleeting crowds that, as Freud calls them, that are instantaneously formed with the same uh, rapidity that is solved. So once they create themselves, these aggregations have disruptive implications on the reality of the urban lives. So if you focus for a moment, you take a newspaper and you read the sudden gangs in the squares of teenagers in Rome, the fights, you see that the reporters, they ignore who is Gustave Le Bon. They apply the same kind of reasoning. That is, these teenagers who fight in the roads, if they're taken individually, they are good persons, good children, so to say, maybe some of them not so good. But anyway, put together, they trigger these forms of rage and violence that they would never do by themselves, individually. So there is a social enabler, so to say, that would justify this transformation. This model is constantly used every time we are faced with phenomena that can range from organized football cheers to sudden urban violence. So actually, they never relate to what Freud is writing, because we are immediately noticing that Freud says that Le Bon has understood nothing about crowds or masses. So I would like to notice, and this has nothing to do with Freud, but it's important, that the concept of crowd was already processed in the French culture, for example, starting from Edgar Allan Poe text translated by Baudelaire, resuming this theory. And so, again, there's no connection with what Le Bon is writing, because for Benham and for Poe, the crowd is a social structure, an urban structure, specifically urban, and it's difficult to find crowds in the mountain or not in the cities. So it's not in the countryside. So it's a sort of layer. So the Edgar Allan Poe narration is narrating a person that is confused in a crowd. The crowd is a place where the individuality is dissolved, but at the same time, it's dissolved not to be manifest in an unforeseeable and violent form. It's to be protected in this sort of layer. At the same time, the crowd is the scenario, is the background from which all of a sudden certain figures might arise. Baudelaire, in his sonnet, says that it can happen that all of a sudden a person can appear in the on the level of the erotic meaning and the disappointment. So the crowd, only Le Bon and other personalities of a certain sociological survey, they have acquired these negative connotations. But then Freud actually, when he tries to reason on masses, the first things that he does, apparently, instead, is to be actually installed in the tradition of social sciences. Social sciences, it's true that sometimes that can also deal about temporary phenomena like the creation of a temporary crowd, but at the same time, they are entrusted with the important task to think instead to the role and the function of the social institutions. So if you look at the Freud texts, you will see that the attention of Freud is focused on institutions and not on crowds, not on temporary or fleeting crowds, where there is a loss of control. And this is interesting for the researcher. Freud explicitly talks about artificial and organized masses. So there is a very important topic. It was 1921, and there is a reason for this timeline, the theme of organization. The masses from which Freud talks is not these places, these fleeting moments, these rapid, temporary moments in which all of a sudden a violent group is created that does something and then is dispersed. It's the other way around. The interest of Freud is focused on the why we are part of in social institutions, entities that are highly organized according to the principles of sociology, that is, social structures become increasingly articulated the more they are diversified, the more the functions and the performances are diversified. And so Freud is referring to this, choosing, not by chance, two pivotal institutions like the church, I specify the Catholic Church, which it is interested, and the army. So what does it mean? It means first that Freud is actually making a sociological operation, if you want. He's intervening actually in social sciences. He is putting himself in the tradition of social sciences that study the formation of social organizations, institutions that shape us, influence us, but at the same time allow us also living associated forms of life. And this is the interest of Freud, the pillars on which these theoretical practices are based, that is psychoanalysis. So the featuring of these institutions is that these are not conceivable without a leader. So that's the core issue. So while the crowd is not to be thought as if there is a leader, and in this regard, I would like to make a digression, a very quick digression. You know that Le Bon explains in two ways the creation of the crowd through the psychic contagion mechanism and through the strength of suggestion. And Freud emphasizes that these are two different things. Instead, Le Bon confuses these two elements because contagion, and in the text there is a very evident example, that is adolescence in a college. One of these girls receives a letter from the boyfriend and has a hysterical reaction, and the others, without even knowing what was the content of this letter, and this is extremely Lacanian as a game, they are immediately having continuous hysterical reactions, and the whole college is then having a collective hysterical reaction. There is, as you can understand, no psychological explanation. It's just this contagion, the psychic contagion effect, which is very similar to the laughing or crying that is transmitted independently from the reason that led this person to cry or to laugh. The surrounding people would laugh or cry for this transmission, as Bataille would say, this contagion of subjectivity that is transferred from one person to another. Instead, Freud said that suggestion that is explained through the mechanism of hypnosis implies that there is an hypnotizer, and paradoxically, Le Bon is never talking about the hypnotizer. And the fact that there has to be an hypnotizer means that suggestion is a vertical relation. Instead, contagion is a horizontal relation that is propagating from one member to another without none of the members creating that whole having a position of predominance. Instead, in the case of suggestion, it's important, it's essential to have a person in a predominant position, that is the hypnotizer. So why am I emphasizing all this? Because the Freudian problem to explain the functioning of social institutions and the implications that they have on individual behaviors, it's necessary to take into account that by translating into psychoanalysis terms these intuitions, these insights from Le Bon, that an institution has two vectors on which it is structured. A vector that could be called verticality and the one of horizontality. This means that if you look at the two chapters, which are really important in the Massimo Psychology text, in my opinion, is identification and totem and taboo, invocated by Freud as a reference model that can explain the formation of human society or civilization and cultures as such. So, if we go to the issue of identification, we know that these two vectors that create the social institution correspond to two connections. Identification, vertical, because it implies identification to the role of the father, and the horizontal one, that's the object-oriented relation that is devoted to the mother. Then Freud would explain all the different combinations and intertwining between these two vectors, the exchanges that can occur, so that the mother can become the identification and the father can become instead an object relation. So there is a long pondering by Freud on the origin of homosexuality in this text, because homosexuality is explained perfectly through the identification with the mother. Thus, those who the mother loves are loved. So the person loves children and would love the children and the brothers of one's mother. So what's important, rather than this possibility to explain the formation of homosexuality, is in the fact that social institution and thus the functioning of social structures in their relations between individuality on the one hand and relation on the other is based on libidic connections. So this is the core relation that this strange science that is psychoanalysis, which is more or less a science, because it has to cope with some scopes, dimensions that are too big to be analyzed. So it is putting this scientific approach into a crisis. And not only the theme of Goethe that is recalled by Lacan in another context, but the fact that there are some dimensions plus value, and for Freud, enjoyment, what we called enjoyment, starting from Lacan, that's the enjoyment which are not explicable within the concept of establishing equations in relations to behaviors. So the science of economy and politics, so goods and money, and exchange from engenders in social relations. So what psychoanalysis can say about society and how social structures actually work, we will discover also the peculiarity of social structures that we call the political scope, which is separated from the social scope, which are not overlapping, at least in the concept of politics as it was developed in the Western society, which is the only one that knows something about politics, because it starts from the Greek polis, whereby the polis, if there is no polis, there is no politics, if not imported from the external scope. So the relations and the maintaining of social structures are based on libidical connections and their complex combination. So in this context, a very important topic to me, and I would like to make explanation in this regard, because it is helping us understand how a social institution is structured. That is, the identification doesn't mean that the object of the identification is chosen as the object in its erotical thrust or erotical desire. The identification it means that we want to be like the subject with which we have identified. To be like means loving as that subject would love, loving the things that this subject would love. So if identification to the father, we would love the things that the father loves and how the father loves. So the first thing that the father apparently would love, and it is not to be given by granted, is the mother, being that actually the presence of the father is in interdiction. So this would explain why these two libidinal impulses, as Freud said at the beginning, do not conflict, but at a certain moment would collide, because the object of the relation, the primary object, is the same object loved by the father. So if I love like my father, with whom I am identified, and as a consequence I love like he loves what he loves, I cannot, but in the end, compete with this common object, that's the mother. And there goes the conflict that Oedipus would solve and never solves. That's the model. So the interesting thing is that social relations assume always two kinds of relations, a vertical one and a horizontal one. So when we try to reduce, for example, let's say in the chapter that I've been giving as a trace to follow, I make an important referral to a text that, as regards the sociological, political reasoning on these issues, had a very high importance. Franz Neumann text in 1954, Neumann, Anguish and Politics. He was reasoning with the school on the authoritative personality. It was an attempt to understand how was it possible to have a formation and the prevalence of political movements like fascism in Italy and National Party, Socialist Party in Germany. And most of all in Germany, rather than in Italy, the juridical principle on which this kind of state was based was the Führer principle, that is the willingness of the Führer that is automatically law in the state.
I do not want to focus on this, because that would apply the state of exception that was present in the Weimar Constitution, and which made it possible for him, Ribbentrop and from Hitler, and then Hitler to apply it, and so to give a constitutional representativeness, the type of power that then they took. So besides this topic, what is interesting to see in Neumann is that Neumann tried to, using mass psychologists and the analysis of ego, this is a text which is fundamental in my view. It is fundamental to discuss it. So he tried to introduce a distinction between good libidinal horizontal bonds and bad vertical libidinal bonds, because he's convinced that the vertical libidinal bond will in the end explain the identification to the boss in the extreme form of the identification, if not of the whole German people, but of good part of it, to the will of the Führer. And the same could also be partly applied to the Italian case with Mussolini. So he desperately tried to introduce a fragmentation in the text with specific elements which I'm not going to focus on, because otherwise we will waste our time, but you can read the text, and I will try also to let you understand where Neumann tries to force Freud's text to make it say things that it didn't really say. And in fact, he said that we could think about horizontal or democratic links of cooperation, while on the other side, vertical relationships of identification with the head, with the chief, that would lead very easily to authoritarian solutions. So I think that this attempt to make this distinction by Neumann is wrong per se, but most especially, I do not think that it gives us any justice to Freud's text, because he doesn't make that difference, because the difference that Freud made, because he was not before any totalitarian or authoritarian states. In fact, back then it was 1921, and then he was Austrian, so his dimension was totally, his reality was totally different. So he had nothing to do with these issues. Rather, it would be, can you conclude in 5 minutes? I'll try that, I'll try. Well, I said it would be useful to dwell on this topic anyway. He was more interested in establishing the necessary coexistence of these two vectors. So it is absolutely not true that a democratic regime does not need to identify with the chief, with the boss. Now, if I only have 5 minutes, I will need to skip a few things. Well, we can give you 8 minutes. Well, with regards to Todometabun, that is a text, and I'm referring to Freudian triviality, as Sergio called it. All this story of the primordial assassin is just a story. There is no empirical data that tells you that something like that happened. But there is a problem. Why did Freud insist so much that this must have been a historic moment, which was not historic in any way? Well, he did so because Freud, and this is another trait that we should better understand. Now, we do not have the time. However, at times, in order to, when we will try to explain human behaviors, you need to invent myths which have no empirical correspondence, but without those myths, we would not be able to understand certain phenomena. This is one of the cases. Totem and taboo is clearly this. In fact, it is not supported by any proof, by any evidence. And also Sergio said it clearly, like the history of the Egyptian Moses, that is an invention. However, that was built, and this is a problem because science needs to have this sort of constructs to be able to explain empirical data that otherwise it would be impossible to explain, or rather it would that would need to be forced into the schemes of a more rigorous science, of a science that is more respectful of rigorous data. I think that at one point science must invent, otherwise it cannot explain phenomena which are real. And this is one of the cases, one of those cases. So why is totem and taboo so important? Because Freud tells us something which is the backbone of everything. We also, I mentioned the identification with the trait of the father. So he said that when, first of all, social psychology is original because the primary mass, as he calls it, is an original datum of the establishment of culture. The culture or civil or human civilization cannot be established if there is no identification to the head, to the boss. And then the identification happens after the killing. It is not a case, in fact, if the boss, if the chief has to be dead, because otherwise there could be no identification. That would not act as a democratic principle. But it is fundamental for Freud that when a social structure, for any reason whatsoever, disgregates, there is just one possibility to keep it together, which is resorting to the trait of father, that is to a vertical identification, without which human societies would fall apart and they stop functioning or existing. So this is also true for any political organization, whether it is an authoritarian organization or whether it is a democratic organization. Also democracy, as Max Weber showed, because it is a democracy, because it gives the power to individuals, it needs a vertical identification to a charismatic leader, because otherwise democracy would end up, as Plato said in the Republic, that is, it will end up in the mouth of the wolf. So if democracy wants to save itself, it needs to embrace the trait of father. And we could also explain this through a model by Jacques Derrida, that is the suicide of the autoimmune suicide of democracies, where he said that democracies, in order to survive, they have to neglect themselves for a time. Well, this is the point that I wanted to make. So I hope that I explained why this text, Mass Psychology, is a very current text, because of course it wouldn't simply help us understand phenomena like Berlusconi, and I'm also very happy to see that there is a new translation of this text with a preface by Davide Caruccio for Einaudi. And then Trump came after Berlusconi, but in reality it's not true that I do not think that this I think that this text is important because it helps us understand how leadership is formed. Well, we should also be, be aware of the fact that parties develop around the leader, but also these leaders are very liquid. Their leadership is so liquid. I think that we should study psychoanalytically what happened to the strange adventure of Giuseppe Conte, who in 2 years became the prime minister of two majorities that were totally at loggerhead with one another. And so we should try to understand that instead of saying, oh no, they're ignorant, they're stupid, they do not know things. No, it would be interesting to understand how that phenomenon was possible, but also what sort of social transformation that in the case. This does not necessarily mean that we are heading towards an apocalyptic form of totalitarian states, but rather I think that we are witnessing some inner transformations in the social forms and the politics. And this transformation is so wide-ranging that we should try and understand them better. So we'll stop here, and then I will add some other things later. Thank you, Bruno. I wanted to highlight something that you said, because you addressed a point that is very interesting to me. You said Freud was not concerned, was not interested in stable aggregations. But also Conte is very liquid. The Conte phenomenon is very liquid. I mean, it's not like Berlusconi, who's been unsaddled for the past 30 years. Well, give him time, just give him time. He's young. He still has many possibilities before him. He will become the leader of what remains of the five-star movement. All right, but besides the phenomenon of Berlusconi, we also witnessed the very liquid aggregations, like aggregations that were very significant. However, they have no leader, they have no glue to keep them together. But I think that one of the contradictions that I found in master psychologists is that Freud tried to explain a link, a bond that is not a social bond in the sense of that it is, made up of many things, of interests or other things, but it is a libidinal bond. So while the church and the army are together for our aggregations for many reasons, maybe there is also the thing of the identification with the leader, but they hold together, they are together because their bond is very complex. What is interesting, what would be interesting to understand is to understand how this liquidity, how this sort of foam comes to be. And I think that Freud said that the foam, this liquidity, is only libidinal, according to Freud. And I think that there is this sort of horizontal bond with the brothers, but this bond somehow breaks away all the other bonds, also the social bonds, also other types of bonds. And it is as if this new bond imposes itself with strength, with force, while the church and the army, but also as other social bonds, do not need so much of this libidinal bond. And another thing that I wanted to say, seeing this as a criticism, I'm not really sure that a clinician would read the episode described by Freud of the girls who reproduce the same reactions of the one who received the letter as a form of contagion. When one starts laughing and all the others start laughing, I think that they would try to read in that something that can be more prone to analysis, because in the end, when you start laughing, when someone starts laughing, is a reaction that today would be defined in different ways. It is a form of one of the most archaic forms of pre-mentalization, while today a clinician would try to see, to read in that relationship probably something that can be more prone to symbolization. So I do not know whether other clinicians are present here, and I do not know whether they would see this as a contagion or as something else. I don't know. But anyway, I think that we could reflect on that later on. I will leave the floor now to Stefano Guerra, so we are moving to psychoanalysis now. Alessandra Campo, she comes from philosophy, but she will only talk about psychoanalysis. Then it will be up to Alessandra. So, Stefano, up to you. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you, Raffaele, for your introduction. I have to say that I really appreciated Bruno Moroncini's presentation, because the clarity, the transparency with which he exposed them. He highlighted the most significant elements of this text is so important, are quite rare. So I really appreciated his presentation. However, there are a few things. Well, the text itself had somehow raised some doubts in me. So we'll try to also somehow spur Bruno so that we could make a general reflection. Well, Bruno focused very rapidly on a point that is the killing, the mythological killing of the father. And this is quite interesting, you know, what you said about myths that build realities without any support, without any historical support. But these myths can be useful, or rather they're fundamental to explain certain phenomena. Well, it is true that these myths help us understand, in this case, a phenomenon of social psychology. However, I also thought about the myth that can be represented in psychoanalysis by the primordial scene, where whether it is seen or not, whether it is really lived out or not, doesn't matter. What matters is what we can use of this reconstruction, even though it is simply fantasy or mythological. If in the primordial order, the killing of the father is due to his to the rebellion to him, and the identification is made possible, and it relies on ambivalence and the civilization. Well, of course, you also talked about civilization relies upon the refusal to replace the father that becomes God. Well, I do not understand why the pulsions, the emotions that are so well controlled by the rules that were given in the name of the father, of the dead father, develop anguish and anxiety so much that a new figure needs to emerge. A new leader needs to emerge that has the task to transform anguish into fear, as if the masses, because this is the solution in the end, you know, the situation, the solution the leader found is to identify, to spot an external point of reference, a people, a scapegoat, let's say, on which the anxiety, the anguish that was a nuisance to the group can be addressed, so that the group can rally around this fear. And this fear, of course, generates a series of behaviors. So now, individually, a 5-year-old, it is an example, because it is a classical psychoanalytical example. So a 5-year-old can dominate this anguish and to focus it, to direct it to a symptom which is called the phobia. So it is very easy to address this when you're a 5-year-old, whereas the mass, the group, cannot do that. And the leader, therefore, simply seems to be the one who can choose well the object of the phobia. So at one point, I have a feeling, but I also would like to reflect on this point. I think that today we are witnessing something which is slightly different, because I have a feeling, and I think about negationists, they are becoming rooted. They do not have a leader, these deniers, but they manage to build these phobias. So maybe even the masses can express these symptoms. Another thing that Bruno Marchini made me think about in his presentation was when he talked about vertical and horizontal movements of the libido. So here, it is true. I mean, Freud has been correctly interpreted as Lacan did, but I was wondering whether this is a vision that is too schematic. So the birth of desire, of the homosexual desire, can be read only as the identification with the mother.
So only the identification with the mother, the reversed identification. So we love what the mother loves. So my feeling, and I'm saying this because I was trained on psychoanalysis, that is a little bit different. Sandro Gindo was my teacher, so some parts of the Freudian psychoanalysis were not included as not fully reliable. Instead, I think that the stratifications are higher, meaning that there are further doublings. The child is identified with the father, loves what the father loves, but also loves directly the father. So the father is an object reference. As for the daughter, the mother, so Freud had difficulties in justifying the sexual choices in this regard. So I think we are a little bit in a regime that does not allow to the male to love the male and the female to love the female as they are, not because they fall in love with the other or if they are narcissists. This narcissistic love is also interesting. If the development of objectual love is implied in recognizing the subjectivity of the other as other, once this connection, this feeling is installed, what kind of relation, rather than homosexuality, can represent loving another person? I love the other person without basing on any kind of support, without having any kind of help. So gender inequalities or other concepts are implied. So this could be another interesting debate to further elaborate on. And then reading the Freudian text, the comment that Moroncini did knocked to my mind the issue that psychoanalysis, not being intended as we mean it, is not a psychology of adaptation. But this doesn't mean that the defense mechanisms shall not be taken into account. I don't want to follow the distinction between good and bad modalities. Instead, I can think that there are some behaviors of the masses that are more sane or insane in this perspective of the psychoanalytic analysis. So maybe studying the defense mechanisms doesn't imply to act on defense mechanisms, doesn't necessarily means to propose an adaptive psychoanalysis, but can make us understand how the person is protecting from the pulses, to understand the history of this. So maybe by studying the defense mechanisms that masses do enact towards this anxiety that cannot be contained, these pulses of anxiety, we might ponder on how to tackle in a more or less sane way the emergency of anxiety. For example, if a single person the individual can express positions that are more developed than others, not thinking that there is already a predefined pattern. Moroncini underlined how the importance of the psychoanalytic approach is to try and understand how the story of a person then in the end would determine his or her development. So if we notice that there is this possibility of evolution, of development, so for example, the capacity to perceive the other as a subject and not as an object to be possessed, for example, we recognize that in a subject that there is a developmental line with the awareness that this development is not finalized, that can resume previous positions, it goes by itself. Anyway, also the defenses do evolve in time, so we can conceive that there are defensive patterns that are more ancient, underlying, and the defensive modalities that are more developed and advanced. So if masses as well have a history in their evolution, as it seems, and if we wanted to think that masses have an evolutionary history, then maybe also masses can use defense mechanisms that are more or less advanced faced with anxiety. So maybe, this was my idea, the more these mechanisms are primitive, the more masses are insane. Talking about groups without leaders, defense mechanisms are considered what is characterizing the groups from the qualitative point of view, so more or less balanced groups. So I think that what Moroncini said on the text that was mentioned, when it says that no direct and immediate relation between the personality of the leader and the fact that he is the object of the identification of the mass. From this point of view, any psychological or sociological explanation in the formation of modern regimes is not targeted. On the contrary, we should identify the trait of the father in the identification process and then understanding the political implications of the government. So in selecting the traits of the father, we could think that what is chosen is what more represents the evolution of the mass, also for defense mechanisms. So I would say that rationalization, symbolization, shifting, these polyhedric masses, like the democratic masses would use, that are multiple, flexible, adaptable, dominated by the culture and language, are different from the totalitarian masses that when they are tempted with regression to the primitive horde, they might choose abnegation, denials, splitting, and projection in a different way. So I think that we could say that the fall, the decline of the social value of knowledge that we are witnessing today could be important factors to understand the difference between these kinds, these twofold kinds of masses. So these are the basic principles I was pondering on, and I wanted to share with you, and I would like to know your opinions. Thank you, Stefano. I have to say that your remark, the last part, is alarming. I don't know what the others think about it. A sort of positive relation between the levels of culture and the quality of the group functioning and the mechanisms of adhesion to the groups. Because I think it's a fallacy that saying that knowledge saves from racism, fascinating for totalitarianism. I think that history has taught that it has been denied. Anyway, this perplexity is just a remark. Alessandra Campo, where are you? I can't see you. Yes, I'm here. Sorry, we can't hear the speaker. Good evening, everyone. I would like to use my bilingualism, that is philosophy and psychoanalysis, but I will speak the psychoanalytic language tonight. And I will pay tribute to Bruno because I will resume the conclusion of his essay that I've been reading through yesterday and today, as Raffaele was mentioning, that democracy is a woman. I'm proposing to you reasoning that is the result of a work I'm doing, and I hope I will convey this message to you. I will finalize this work and again share the results with you. So, if Bruno intervention was democracy and the trait of the father, my brief intervention would be titled "Democracy and its meanings." I want to start from what you have already mentioned. The connection with the leader is an identification. So for Freud, we are hypnotized because we are identified with the leader. And Bruno is wondering, fairly enough, if the basic connection, this primary connection that explains the primary fact that it is suggestion identification, a theoretical anti-fascism would wonder what's this trait that generates this identification. Monitoring a fascist would mean to wonder what's the trait that produces this identification. And Bruno's proposal is that it's the trait of a father. Why? If I've interpreted it correctly, because the leader would mitigate anxiety as a father would do. The father metaphor, the function of the father for Lacan, who mitigates anxiety because he localizes, signifying it and limits it. So that the leader, the trait of the father, will be this trait of localizing anxiety. The first problem is it the trait of a father because Freud says that it's a phallic trait. So as Bruno said, the father metaphor means enjoyment. It's a phallic signification, so it's a phallic trait. But there's also another aspect. We might say that the reassuring function of the leader is a function, as Berlusconi was mentioned in the conclusion from Bruno, it is the reassuring function because the leader, that is, Freud says that it's the horde is the basis of the mass. So the leader is a totemic father who enjoys endlessly an endless power that, as Bataille says, disrupts in the homogeneous society as something else, this power that can anything that can help the army of those who are excluded, as Bruno says. So redeeming those who are less powerful. So it's an identification with the leader, it's an identification with the phallic image, whereby phallic means power. And as we know, the fantasy of power, the identification in a powerful image moves from an impotence, as Lacan says in Seminar 10 on anxiety. So it's a non-power that makes power attractive. So the identification with the father is an identification with a narcissistic figure, is an ideal ego that is replacing the ego, an image in which is directly proportional to the precariousness feeling. So the first question is the trait of the father. The father is phallic in all cases. That's the question. And the other thing I would like to emphasize is that the fantasy of power, I absolutely disagree that democracy is a woman. And I would like to take this occasion to say that I cannot stand this fact that a woman is good and the man is evil. It's not good for me. And this is not good because the fantasy of power is not only male, it's not only just the anatomical fantasy. So powerful is not only male, as it is phallic, and phallic regards everyone, men, women, and women. So another important point that I would like to stress of proving this asexual trait is that the mythical father of the horde that is almighty is not so different from the lovers identified in the mother. Il dasding, the vortex of the lovers, always need require anxiety. Instead, the father, the leader, is reassuring, but both have to be killed. So the father has to be killed to create a society. So the father and the mother identified as a mantis have some connections. So these issues have not to be based on gender inequalities. Anyway, the fascist body, even though it's fabricated, excluding what Tablet called the trait of the woman as an inspiration to this author. So I would say that fascism is a trait of a woman because the fascist body is produced on a trait of a woman that Littell explains widely. What's the trait of this woman? The fascist body is a dried body who refuses the wet, refuses the wet, the mud. And so the fascist woman is very similar. The fascist body is very similar to the woman, as Lacan says, it's without organs. It's a body that does not defecate. It's pure. It's not. It's very far from the impure, like a lady. So this concept of the power being male and democracy female, well, I disagree on this. So theoretical anti-fascism, sorry, there's no connection, there's no audio. So we have to wonder if there is another trait of the father which is not only phallic, and if there is another concept of a woman, like wondering if there is a non-fascist collective approach, as Freud is wrong by saying that each collective is fascist by nature. So I think that there is another concept of the father and another concept of woman. That is the father, as the long tradition is telling us, the father as a paternal function that is based on nothing, a void of fullness at the same time, and the woman, so not a woman, but the woman, the feminine, is characterized at the same time as a subjectivity that is based on this nothing, this void, and a digression, a lack of penis and presence of something else. So by speaking in these terms, many problems are solved. So though there is another concept of the woman, another concept of the father, I disagree with Bruno that democracy is a woman, and I disagree with the fact that fascism empowers man and male. I would say that the phallic regards everyone, men and women. So, and there are again problems of connection. So an anti-fascism is not only gender-based, but has to generate something that is as common and as universal as the phallus, and everything that can be replaced by this is organs. So we are all bodies made up of organs. So organ against phallus. That would be the opposition, as Lacan in Seminar 10 proposes. So the atax legomenon of the organ phallus is introduced, the real phallus. This is the first operation. The second operation, and maybe the most interesting one, in the Seminar 10 on anxiety, Lacan basically acknowledges that what the father will do, the father metaphor, the reassuring, the localization of anxiety. And so Lacan says that this is done by anxiety itself, if it is bearable, because for Lacan, anxiety is without object, but it produces itself its object. So there is a production. So anxiety produces an object, so it's a digestive, it's an intestinal procedure by which anxiety itself localizes the sting in a specific object and does this because when we are in a state of anxiety, in the end, we actually are capable of overcoming anxiety. And so I would like to go on, but please, Raffaele, tell me if I have time enough. Oh, well, you have ended your time slot. Okay, so we'll conclude. And then if you want to have more information, I would like to conclude by saying that we are capable of digesting anxiety in this way. And so I think that democracy, rather than being a woman, is belonging to everyone that can bear anxiety, which is not a castration. Because in Seminar 10, Lacan says that castration is the symbol of separation. So democracy needs strong spirits that accept to lose something by knowing that things are finite, as it means that we need to want the end of something, but also to wish desire, which has a cycle. And so democracy needs those spirits, as Lacan says, that can eat the phallus. What does it mean to eat the phallus, and how does it take place? We have to understand that anxiety by itself does what the father metaphor does, can cut in pieces the sign, phallus, and consistency, and returning it in the form of an organ. The condition to do that, and I'm saying this just because it's funny, is that unlike the mythical meal that is eaten by the brothers after killing the father, eating his organs, here the meal always regards the death of the phallus of God and the Father, but this death is produced by the meal. And so the only condition, psychoanalysis is not only Lacan, but also common sense and philosophy, what is teaching us that in order to eat, it's not an autophagy, it's not the self eating itself. This is something else. It's an organ that has to be eaten. So I will shorten it up by saying that Lacan says in Seminar 7,
ogni tanto per tutto, che per Lacan è un'esca che sorge sul posto di Das Ding, questa è una definizione che dà, vuol dire in qualche modo mangiarsi un corrosivo.
So it means to eat a sort of laxative that would then secrete the organ. Thank you, Alessandra. Please allow me.
Il tratto di organo di senso che potrebbe avere questa.
This could be the trait of an organ.
No, è proprio il senso, è proprio no, perché si tratta di produrre un insensato.
No,
cioè
because it means to produce something which is senseless.
non è nulla di sensato.
It does not make any sense because it is produced through the Sphinx. So it is the reference to the bowels and so on. It was something that was wanted. Yes, absolutely. Another thing that I addressed to Lacan in saying that the democracy female, well, I don't think that that was a compliment to Bruno, isn't it? Because it also bears with it a sense of impossibility, of incompleteness. So we could read it as a compliment, but it could also be read, I do not know what Bruno thinks about it. So I would like to leave the floor to Bruno, some 10 minutes, and then if you want to take the floor, please say it in the chat so that we can take your questions. Bruno, thank you for all your comments. I don't think that I'm going to answer to all of the points that were raised, but I would like to make a few points. Well, probably because we didn't have a lot of time, or probably because certain things require more time. I have a feeling that probably I was not clear in explaining some of the terms that I used. Let us start from the trait of father, which is quite complex. Well, in the chapter on identification, Freud talks about some ways in which the identification happens. And these, one of these is the identification to the trait, ein einziger Zug, one single trait. So from the general picture, from the general figure, a trait, a specific trait is isolated, not by choice, but because of the various relationships which are established. And that trait helps the identification. So this has a very important effect because we are used when we want to explain this problem of the relationship between the masses and the leader. So we are used to do psychology, and that means to try and describe what criminals do today. No, to do profiling. I mean, anything can be done in psychoanalysis with the exception of profiling, because if you start doing that, that will be the end. So if psychoanalysts start to do that, well, they are not real psychoanalysts. So we take the person as a whole, and you think that you can identify with that person to the whole person, but it is not so. What Freud says is something totally different, and we have to start thinking about that if we want to apply some criteria indicated by Freud in this text to the interpretation of phenomena that we have experienced in our intersubjectivity. So if you follow the Berlusconi phenomenon, well, probably they were not identified. They did not identify with Berlusconi. We do not know what was the trait that captured them to Berlusconi. We might understand that if we had analyzed all Berlusconi supporters, or those who identified with him, what they declared, what they said from our viewpoint, even though I say that, even though I'm not a psychoanalyst, what they said is not so important, because what mattered was not what they said about Berlusconi, that he was a successful businessman and so on and so forth, that he promised the moon to everyone, but it was the trait that was important, but we do not know which trait is important. That would be important, interesting to understand. I do not know with what tools we could do that, because that is very complex. So it means that there is no psychological relationship. When I talk about the trait of father, I talked about the Zug. That is what Lacan has also enhanced, and he linked this idea of the trait to the signifier. That is what matters in psychoanalysis. The rest does not matter, and this is the contribution of psychoanalysis to social sciences, because otherwise they would mix up their object and take it as an object that can be explained totally through the conscious declarations that the individuals make about what they live or not. But that is not important to us. Why should the trait be the trait of father? Well, because in my view, in psychoanalysis, this has a structural reason. Then you can also decide to put psychoanalysis aside. But if you put yourself in the Freudian psychoanalytical perspective, then the figure of the father is fundamental. Then you might also know that Oedipus is a myth. Lacan says that very clearly. He said, I tried to introduce an expression to replace the paternal metaphor, but psychanalysts continue to call it Oedipus, but it is not a matter of the family triangle between among mother, father, child. It is the father metaphor. It is the signifier of the father that makes it possible to organize the psychological life. And the trait of father is fundamental because it is the only way through which a mass can be developed, a mass that can actually stand the difficulties of life, even the dangers, even challenges. And there is also a passage that is fundamental in my point, in my view, when Freud says, against Le Bon once again, that the masses can have their own morals, that whereas an individual wouldn't have that type of model. So it is really a reversal of the Bon's model. And I think that this is interesting. I do not agree with this thing, with the fact that, for instance, during the pandemic, we've seen that a social institution, doctors, hospital, medical staff, that were taken as a mass of people that opposed a common enemy that was represented by the coronavirus. So in a way, they identified with a trait. And then individual doctors, well, we see them, they are, normal people when they're interviewed on television, and we see them clearly, and we also see the worst traits of them. There were traits, but there is a trait that made this identification possible. And this was a social identification that made it that phenomenon possible, because otherwise it was not possible to understand that during the first lockdown, we were all locked up at home and we were happy to be locked down at home. Now we're not very happy to be isolated. So this is why psychoanalysis is so important to interpret things. How can we explain the fact that a society like the Italian one has responded in February in such a participatory way to a great limitation of its forms of life, because we identified with the trait of father. There was no other possibility. That is what psychoanalysis and this text in particular help us understand. Another issue, and I hope that this is clear, this problem is clear. I hope that you understood what I mean by trait of father. And I'm not talking about how fathers really are in reality. I do not care about that. I do not care how they are or how they're not. I think that any organized mass, the organization of any mass is allowed by the horizontal bonds among its members. So the mutual recognition also in the form of contagion, when, for instance, all the Italians went out on the balconies. I want to say that I was not on the balcony singing. Well, they looked at one another in the face, and it was the objective relationship that was being developed, and that it was made possible by the identification with the trait. So this is what I tried to explain. Maybe I didn't, I was not clear at all. Second issue that I wanted to clarify. It is clear that today's society is a society, but what sort of society? The Western society, because for instance, Eastern societies are much less liquid than we think. The Chinese and the Koreans, of course, so which means that communism had nothing to do with them, but what mattered for them was the cultural structure. Well, these cultures responded to coronavirus much better than the Western cultures, where, as we said, we cannot prevent people from going out because we cannot infringe, their freedom. Now that it's so in China, in South Korea, where they're not communists. So, there again, there is a problem of societies which are not liquid at all. Rather, they are holistic. Western societies are liquid societies. So, and also the matter of leaders, temporary leaders come and go, but the institutions, they stay. And also believing that the body of the king also has therapeutic functions is not something that only concerns Berlusconi. The kings of France were considered as healers. It was believed that they simply by laying their hands they could heal sick people. It is part of the social structures of anthropology. This is what Freud used. Of course, he didn't care about the five-star movement, a small political group that will disappear in the space of a few years. This has nothing to do with that, because it's the political and institutional structures that will hold. Political parties have all died out, but then, political parties, probably they will all die out. So here we are talking about social structures. I was not talking about politics, but rather I was talking about social structures, and I was talking also the matter of anxiety. I didn't mention anxiety, but Freud is very clear about that, because anxiety is the result, it is the effect, not so much of the representative establishment of the primary mass, but of its dissolution. And when masses dissolve, institutions disappear because there are external events that hit them, and that generates anguish and anxiety. So we need to try and translate anguish or anxiety into fear, and we might even believe that the responsibility for the anxiety depends on a minority group that then becomes the scapegoat, and that is at the receiving end of the rage of the whole society. Bruno, do you think that this interpretation of the masses anguish has anything to do with Durkheim? I don't know, maybe Freud. I think that he is in the tradition, he places himself in the tradition of the real sociology, not Le Bon sociology. This is what I wanted to say in my presentation. I think that Freud focuses on the institutions and their consistency, what builds, what establishes institutions, and what might generate their destruction, and how can you avoid their dissolution. And then let me talk about democracy is female. Probably I was not clear enough. It was not my intention to, I mean, I want to tell Alessandra, I do not think that women are good and men are evil, or with all these things, you know, that you said. When I said that democracy is female, if you consider what I wrote earlier in the book, I was simply referring to one thing, that is to the fact that it is not possible. I mean, bear in mind that the title of this essay is a bit Lacanian, because democracy is not for everyone. It can be interpreted as, you know, oh, this is, you know, an aristocratic. He believes that democracy is only for a few people. No, democracy is not for everyone. It means that democracy does not rely upon the universal quantifier all, which is something different. It is a logical matter, because the formulas of sexualization are logical formula, and Lacan thought about them because they're logical formula. The phallus is not the organ, and I do not believe that we have to go back to the organ, because if we do that, it would mean that we go back to the 5 incarnations of object A, that is a body that no longer has a fragmented body, that is no longer has a unitarian body, that is no longer one, and therefore we have that autistic enjoyment that Lacan calls it union, which is something quite different. So the problem is that women, according to the formulas of sexualization which are developed by Lacan, replace or reinterpret the things that Freud had tried to present around the sexual difference. And Lacan continues to be Freudian on one thing, that is, sexual difference is not something anatomic, it is not something biological, it is not cultural even, it is a logical thing. It depends on the fact that there is a trait, and if there is a trait, we have its sex, and when there is not such trait, we have different sex or gender. So it is so the phallus is a signifier. That is why it is important. It is, and I was really also surprised by the fact that you can propose, you know, feminism, that you can talk about feminism. No, I was not talking about feminism. I didn't, no, because no, I mean, when I say that democracy is female, I don't want to mean that we're not better if they
Però c'è la
rule the
questione
country.
del non tutta, la
But there is also another matter, because the matter of incompleteness seems to only be feminine, whereas I would like to, sorry, there are overlapping voices. So it is, sorry, there are overlapping voices. Sorry. So if I may try to explain that, because, I mean, you are opposing to the quantifier all, the fact that this proposition is all men are mortal, all men are this, and this is not possible according to Lacan for a series of reasons which I am not going to go through. I cannot explain that. It is not possible to transfer that also on you can apply that to female sexualization, which doesn't mean women from an anatomical standpoint. There are also men who enjoy, for instance, St. John of the Cross was a man who was sexuated in the feminine terms, according to Lacan. So this is not the problem. The problem is that we cannot identify or form the universal concept of men, because women are not all. So what I am interested in is the logical category of the non-all. Sorry, Bruno. I would simply like to have a very short answer from you. So the idea that for you, that the limit to the power, they give themselves, see, this category is a limit to the power. Okay, doesn't matter whether we call it women or men, but the logical discourse of the not all also tends to limit the invasiveness of the phallic power, let's say. No, it's not so, because women are phallic and non-phallic. This is not the point. According to Lacan, it has never been a matter of, opposition, of gender opposition or gender conflict. That is a logical conflict. I mean, the non-all category is a logical category. That's the point. So my idea is that democracy as a form of government concerns more the implementation of the category of the not all category than other forms of government. That what you said, besides this, besides what we said, so this is the matter, simply. I mean, the notions of democracy are notions in which we have to do with the impossibility to combine in one whole a multitude of people, and therefore they have to be diversified. I mean, we can, the matter for me is a logical matter. Why? Because democracy is logical, because democracy concerns the whole people, all the citizens. So I think that for instance, the Five-Star Movement talked about that because they use also philosophy, and philosophy is also used by idiots. So the issue is never the non-culture of people, but the problem is the effects that culture produces also on stupids. This is the matter that the point that we should try and analyze. Okay. It is a logical matter. Democracy is not, it is something that needs to include everyone, and all the components of democracy is conceived as a separate individual. This was what I wanted to say. Then democracy is female. Well, I simply referred to the formulas of sexualization as intended by Lacan. This is all. All right, so we have a question by DeSantis, and then we will leave just a few minutes to Stefano and Alessandro, and then then Bruno will close. Well, first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations. I was most especially thank Professor Moroncini for the way in which he explained his book, and I would also like to thank Stefano and Alessandra Campo. And most especially, I would like to refer to what Alessandra Campo said, because I was really positively surprised by what she said, because one of the topics that has always, somehow struck me is the fact that in totem and taboos, and in the various Freud's works, well, maybe I might seem trivial, but the female element never appears. Women are always objects. And the thing has always surprised me, even though I'm not a feminist, but the thing has always surprised me. Now, what Alessandra Campo said made me think about a book that I read that was very interesting, and I read it, which is Eros e Priapo by Gadda. And in that book, there are very strong female figures, according to Gadda, of course. And the female figure was the root cause of Mussolini dictatorship. And in this book, the female figure is the figure that falls in love with the phallus. So Mussolini represents the phallus, and Priapus represents the phallus. Mussolini as Priapus is the representation of Priapus. So we have the idea of this dictatorship. So we have the identification that does not directly passes through human beings, men, the identification of men with Mussolini, the leader, but this identification passes through love. So all the women, according to Gadda, were in love with with Mussolini. So all the women, they want Mussolini. All the men identify with Priapus to
identified
get
with Marcellone
to have sexual
sexual
intercourse with
relations
women.
with women. So there's a whole channel of emotions. It's a strange identification, meaning that the very strong female participation that is a sort of in between the predominant figure and the non-predominant ones. So it was very interesting, very curious reading on. So I agree, even though Professor Moroncini says that we have not understood, and maybe it's true, but I quite agree with the statement by Alessandra Campo. That is eliminating the fact, denying the fact that of goodism and associating the good with the woman. So I agree with this. In the light of these remarks, I would like to conclude by saying that, as Professor Moroncini said, the mythical figure of the father who is killed, the totemic meal by the sons or the daughters, is not to be demonstrated, but these myths allow us to understand. Without the myths, we could not understand certain things. Myths can be created also in a personal way. I can imagine a myth that justifies the theory refers to the myth, and the myth refers to the theory. There's a loop in which everyone is right. So maybe it's a trivial question, but I've tried to lighten up some doubts I had, and also some agreements. Thank you, Pietro. Cristiana Cimino has a question. Please, briefly, it's 8:15. You have the floor. Yes, can you hear me? Thank you. Oh, it's just a short remark. I would like to thank Bruno and Alessandra because you have paved the way. You have opened up the Pandora box. So clearly, the identification is the identification to the significant. That's the trait, and it's self-evident that anxiety is fenced by the phallus, is delimited by the phallus. I won't wait too long. The interesting thing is to wonder, if possible, for you philosophers and us psychoanalysts, how the whole and the non-whole can be combined. The phallic support, is it really needed? It's not a provocation, it's a real question. I wonder every day about this. Or it's just, a story we tell ourselves because we do not want to do without the phallus against anxiety. And then there is the non-whole, as Bruno said, and Alessandra in different ways. That's a ground to go back to Bruno in the saxic mechanisms. How can these two wholes compete? And then I will conclude. And how can we have something so aversive It cannot be written down due to its origin. It vanishes out to have not only the abyss of the female trait, so how can we interpret this without structure and without the phallic symbol, as Bruno said? The male for Lacan has nothing to do with having the penis or not having the penis. This is Freud. The phallus is a significant, and there is an Oedipus, according to which the phallus and the phallic relation and everything else. So the challenge is how, and if it is possible, to put together these two universes, the structure and the structure beyond the structure. So let's not give for granted. So philosophy, of course, opens up a problem, and so biology, the relation between biology and the symbolic dimension. I believe that a doubt still remains. What kind of relation can we create or can be created with this biological body? And there's the book by Moroncini, if I'm not mistaken, this biological scope, it's a sort of worry. So I would like to give 2 minutes to Stefano, 2 minutes to Alessandra, and the final 10 minutes to conclude at 8:30, so with Bruno Moroncini. I will be even quicker than 2 minutes. Maybe I do not understand, but I would like to ask to Professor Moroncini. If in some way a renunciation to the phallic centrality to be cannibalized by the children can be a trait of the father. Can it be considered a trait of the father? Alessandra, you have 1 minute and a half, not more. As Stefano was brief. Yes, I have more time then. Anyway, I will be brief. So I answer to Cristiano by saying that I wanted to propose a definition of non-fascist collective that opens up the text by Bruno, a Lacanian one that I've always been convinced as it's a way to answer to your question. Cristiana, Lacan says that we have to be united to produce something and that we have to dissolve. So he proposes a periodical collective at alternate cycles, and it is a model of individualization, meaning that we do not have to go without identification, but we have to create less rigid identifications, provisional ones, to do the thing and then to dissolve to do something else. So converging and diverging, eating something and making it up to the end and then defecating, being that pulsional body. So pulse gets in and gets out. So it's a non-fascist model of a body. It's a functional body that is third to the fascist body. So that is the image in the mirror, and also the fragmented body. It's a body that by itself is localized and fenced in certain areas. That's the definition of the non-whole to me. The fact of being delimited to keep the limit. It's not just being man and women. The recall to biology was not a recall to anatomy. It was a thinking at the Lacan of the 10th seminar. So for those of you who know that, you might follow me better. So the issue of the organs is a functional body that is identified in certain areas. So this delimitation is to be interpreted with the anti-fascism. There is to breaking, to be autonomous. And so analysis is anti-hypnotic. The analytical work tries to make a disidentification from the fallacies. It's anti-fascist. It's a way, and I would like to conclude by saying that I would like to share with you, Bruno, I agree with you, but that was a sentence in your text, which I really share. The model that I wanted to propose as an alternative to identification is an expressive model. What do I mean with this? It's rather than traits, because in the trait we identify ourselves, we have to identify ourselves in the sign, in the symptoms. That is the whole reasoning on the symptom. The collective periodical by Lacan is a collective that makes a sign. So the politics as a void is something which is not meaningful. So it's something that cannot be treated. So if we identify ourselves what we are, we become symptoms. And there is the Lacan of the 23rd seminar. We are a bit less sensible to the phallus. So how to understand, to be in the structure. The work by Bataille on sovereignty. Alessandra, sorry, we are late. Yes, I would like to conclude with by saying that it's a matter of knocking down the heads as they form themselves. So waiting a little bit before the church and the army is formed. Yes, killing something because something is even born. Yes, I mean, it's a serious issue. Well, to a certain extent, we have to prevent these to grow up too much. We have to put them away with the metaphor of the children, not blocking their growth, but letting them go. Yes, this anatomical metaphor is, I think, that is leaving everyone satisfied. Freud said, the anatomy is destiny. So Bruno, you can conclude. Well, first of all, I agree with Alessandra. So we solved this problem. I agree with you, Alessandra. Okay, very well. More than this, what you said, and somehow is present in Freud's text. I couldn't, in the final chapter, Freud makes us understand that the way to escape the grasp of a social institution that is too rigid, is too restrictive, is in the fact that, luckily enough, we belong to more institutions, to more masses, or organized masses. And so we can, play around with a mass against another, and we can even dissolve when these masses become too rigid. The only thing on which allow me to say that there are some difficulties is in also considering the issue of the fragmentation of the body, because the reduction of the body to different parts is a complex issue. It's true that Lacan will theorize the symptom, that it's a way to abandon the classical way that revealed itself as a very difficult to be implemented. But I'm not fully convinced that we have to follow the fragmentation, because the fragmentation means that maybe it's an increase in anxiety. That's an hypothesis. It's not the fragmentation. The lipidal body is a third body. It's a third thing that comes in the end. What Lacan is telling us, and I would like to make a personal example on this, is that enjoyment, that is a phallic enjoyment, it's a complicated enjoyment, we don't know how to describe it, the other enjoyment, the female one, goes through, not through a third of the body, but through the image of the body. So the body actually is not functioning when the body, with its specific parts, with the incarnation of the object A, we are faced with a problem, because it's not always true that anxiety can be overcome and solved anyway. This is a problem on which we can come back again. So I would like to stick to the text. This concept of Freud, who does not understand women, I think it's something we have to consider. Private aspects of the life of Freud, his relation with his wife. We might investigate this, but this will be a psychoanalytical approach that is really hard to understand. But to stay with the totem and taboo, women, in the perspective of totem and taboo, how were these women? Due to the fact that this text starts with Darwin, the way in which the problem is, what are the species, the living species doing? Living species are doing something. They try to last and they try to reproduce themselves as much as possible. That's it. And due to the fact that the human species belongs to the advanced mammals, they reproduce themselves through a sexual difference, then in the original constitution of the society, women are the object of exchange because they are extremely important being reproductive. Because through women, females, there is the reproduction of the species. So this issue has nothing to do with the emancipation of women. There's nothing to do with that. That's the theoretical model that is used by Freud, the Darwinian model. And so what is it supposed to do, rather than saying we have in the reproduction of a living species of superior mammals, we have what actually we know very well that it exists. The leader of a group that has the possession of women and excludes children. Then in the end, he gets old, they fight for prestige, and the younger replaces the older, and so on. So the Freudian issue is that anthropology, ethnography is telling us that human societies are based on the regime of matrimonial exchanges. Totem and taboo is the attempt to build a theory that, of course, is not empirical basis, to explain how is it possible that a living species, as the human species is, that as a consequence has the obligation and the only thrust to reproduction, and does that through the sexual differentiation, that's the precondition, how this is meeting exogamy, the fact that there is the taboo. And I have to find a woman avoiding an incest. So what is Freud saying? It's a great theoretical invention. We should always be very practical. He says that there is a violent detachment, there is a killing, and the human history is based on this. That's the meaning of totem and taboo. It's not important if it does not relate to anything that can be objectively reconstructed. The theory is important. How can I explain that a species that should be structured according to the model of the deers, horses, or monkeys in the end, or orangutango, as Lacan says, instead applies the criterion of exchanging females outside consanguinity. So that's the theoretical condition that creates the basis, the structure of the construction of human society as it is known through the ethnography as a science. So the myth, it's very difficult to follow. You have 2 minutes, Bruno. Myths are not invented. Myths, as Freud says, it is said in this text, are an invention, social invention. No one is inventing myths, even because if we would invent a myth, if the myth has its capacity of reproduction, this means that this invention was needed to a society to understand itself to establish which are its foundations. Myths do not exist. The technicized myths do not exist. Carqueren, a great author of antiquity, the myth is something that functions. Oedipus is a myth. It belongs to the ancient mythical world. There's no doubt on this. It's a myth, but it works. It's functional because it allows us to explain the phenomena of human relations that otherwise we could not explain. And we would need to explain that with the cognitivism or neurosciences. So we have to decide that. Either we say that psychoanalysis is an invention and it's not supportable, then we are neuroscientists or cognitivists. Or psychoanalysis is something that is serious and that is important and has to be taken seriously into account. It has been to be taken into account seriously for those aspects that from the scientific point of view, hard or soft sciences, as something that are completely invented. That's the point. And culture goes on like this. Culture does not follow the criterion of self-interpretation of scientists who are curious and want to understand how the world works. It's not that the scientists could not do that. There's something else. And I would like to conclude with this statement. I hope I was clear. So, on this very well done defense of psychoanalysis, we cannot but thank you. You said that totem and taboo is built on the deers or the monkeys. So also the concept of sexuality is based on this sort of a leader, belonging, everything. Well, Raffaele, that's a datum. All the documentary on the TV are showing that also in the monkey groups there's a leader, but it has nothing to do with feminism. It has nothing to do with that. Primates are done in this way, and we are not done in this way. Yes, I'm saying something else. There's a family of bonobo primates who have passioned the ethologists because they are the only animal beings who are very active in the French kiss. Their sexuality is human-like, which is surprising, the ethologists. Bonobo are human-like sexual animals. Well, the concept that we have of primates being violent is a total fake. Thinking that a male, a leader is bad is not true. That's the natural functioning. The problem is the difference with the humans, and we are all living species. Well, let's not reopen the debate about the natural behavior. Otherwise, we might quarrel on this. I would like instead to thank you. It was a very enthusiastic debate, a journey in Freud and Psychologia and the analysis of the self. So it was a very, I would say, wonderful beginning for this series of seminars. I would like to thank Stefano Guerra, Alessandra Campo. I would like to remind you that there is a website where you can find all the information, www.Psicologia, and I will pronounce it in German, Psicologia. We will need to add and Egoanalyse. Anyway, it's only massenpsychologie.com. So you have this website. I'd like to remind you again, the meeting on next 12 March at 6 p.m. Italian time. Romano Madera is the main speaker. The title is Disposition to Sociability and Pseudo-Socialization. De Fiore and Lolly will debate on this. You will find it on the website. Thank you, everyone. I hope to meet you all again in the next seminar on the 12th of March at 6 p.m. Enjoy your evening. Thank you. Goodbye.